Notification came through at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening. I know the exact time because I'd been watching the clock. My sister had asked me to be at her place by 7 and I was already running behind, mascara on one eye, heels in my hand, cursing myself for agreeing to drive 40 minutes across town on a weeknight. I grabbed my phone to text her that I'd be late, and that's when I saw it. A message from my bank. Not a promotional email, not a fraud alert about some $5 Venmo charge. A message that said my checking account balance was negative $212. I stood in my bathroom doorway with one eye done and my heart somewhere near the floor. I had deposited my entire paycheck 4 days earlier, $1,100. It was supposed to cover rent, my car insurance, and groceries for the next 2 weeks. I opened the app with the specific kind of dread you feel when you already know something is wrong, but you're praying you misread it. I hadn't misread it. There were 11 transactions I didn't recognize, all from the same 2-day window. Gas stations in a town I'd never been to. A hardware store. 3 ATM withdrawals in cash, each for $200. And a charge at a motel off the interstate that I couldn't even place on a map. My first thought was that my card had been cloned. It happens. I'd heard the stories. I started to dial the bank's fraud line, and then I scrolled up one more time, and I saw the ATM withdrawal location, the branch on Elm Street, in my sister's neighborhood. I sat down on the bathroom floor. Her name is Cassidy. She's 4 years older than me, which makes her 31, and for most of my life, she has been my favorite person in the world. That's not something I say lightly. Our parents divorced when I was 8, and she was 12, and the way I remember it, Cassidy was the only constant. She was the one who walked me to school after the split. The one who made me grilled cheese on nights our mom worked late. When I moved to Columbus for a job out of college, she followed me 8 months later, and I thought that was the most flattering thing anyone had ever done for me. We had dinner together most weeks. I had a key to her apartment. She knew my ATM PIN. She knew my ATM PIN because 18 months ago I'd asked her to grab cash for me when I was stuck at work, and we were going to a concert that night. I'd given it to her over the phone and never changed it. Why would I? It was Cassidy. I sat on that bathroom floor for a long time before I called her. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was completely normal. Bright even. Hey, are you on your way? I've got the pasta almost done. I need you to tell me something, I said, and I need you to tell me the truth. A beat. Just half a second too long. What's going on? Were you at the Wells Fargo on Elm Street on Saturday? She laughed. An actual laugh. Not nervous, not guilty, just a small, confused laugh. What? Why? Were you? The laugh faded. Yeah, I drive by there all the time, Cassidy. Silence. Did you take money out of my account? What followed was maybe 15 seconds of quiet, and I learned something about myself in those 15 seconds, which is that some part of me was fully expecting her to say no. Fully expecting her to say, of course not, what are you talking about? And then we'd figure out together that someone had stolen my card number on mine or something. Some part of me was so certain of who my sister was that I was already planning how to apologize for asking. Instead, she said, I was going to pay you back. I drove to her apartment anyway. I don't know why. Maybe because I couldn't figure out what else to do, or maybe because I needed to see her face. She opened the door looking exactly like herself, hair pulled back, oversized sweatshirt, bare feet, pasta actually bubbling on the stove. I stood in the doorway and looked at my sister and tried to find something in her expression that explained the last hour of my life. How much? I asked. She told me the number, not just from the past week, from the past several months. My sister had been accessing my account since March. Not constantly, just here and there, small amounts when she thought I wouldn't notice, with 2 larger withdrawals in the last week when she'd apparently gotten careless or desperate or both. When I added it all up, sitting at her kitchen table with my hands flat on the surface because I didn't know what to do with them, the number was a little over $4,000. I was in a bad place, she said. I owe people money. I panicked. You owe people money. I panicked. I know how that sounds. Cassidy, I make $43,000 a year. I don't have $4,000 sitting around that I just don't notice. She looked at the table. I know. Then why? Because you always figure it out. Her voice cracked on that last word, and I remember being furious at myself for the half-second of sympathy I felt before I pushed it back down. You always figure it out. You budget, you save, you manage. I didn't think you'd. I thought it would be smaller. It got out of hand. I asked her what she meant by owing people money. I asked who she owed and how much and why, and the next 45 minutes were some of the strangest of my life. Because what came out of my sister's mouth, sitting at that kitchen table with the pasta going cold on the stove, was not the story I was prepared for. Cassidy had gotten involved with someone the previous summer. Not romantically, professionally, she said, though the word felt hollow by the time she finished explaining. A man she'd met through a mutual friend who ran what he described as a property investment network, private lending. He brought in investors, pooled the money, funded short-term real estate loans, paid out monthly returns. He had a website, he had a portfolio of properties he'd supposedly funded. He had testimonials. She'd invested $6,000 of her own savings. Then she'd borrowed money from two of her friends and invested that too, because she was so convinced, because the monthly payouts had been real and consistent for the first 4 months, because she thought she was helping them. They'd each put in between $1,000 and $3,000. By January, the payouts had stopped. By February, she couldn't reach the man by phone. By March, the website was gone. She owed her friends their money back. She was too ashamed to tell them what had happened, so she kept telling them there were processing delays. She was working on it, just another few weeks. She borrowed from one credit card to make partial payments to another. She took out a personal loan she couldn't afford. And somewhere in all of that, she had started taking small amounts from my account. Probably telling herself the same thing she told me, that she'd pay it back, that I wouldn't notice, that it was temporary. I sat across from my sister and I thought about how I would describe this to someone. I thought about calling my mom. I thought about the friends Cassidy had dragged into this, these women I'd met at birthday dinners, whose faces I knew, who were probably still waiting on their money and had no idea it was gone for good. Have you talked to anyone about this? I asked. A lawyer? The police? She shook her head. She looked exhausted. Like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had just set it down, except the setting down hadn't brought relief. You were scammed, I said. Cassidy. What he ran was a Ponzi scheme. I know that now. The early payouts were from new investors' money. That's textbook. I know. And you put your friends' money into it. She didn't answer that. She just looked at the table, and that's when I understood that we weren't only talking about what she'd done to me. I went home that night and I didn't sleep. I want to be honest about what those hours were like, because I think it's easy to tell a story like this in a way that makes it sound cleaner than it was. The truth is that I spent a significant portion of that night crying in a way I hadn't cried in years. The ugly, gasping kind that embarrasses you even when you're alone. I cried for my money, which was immediate and practical and felt shameful to cry about but was also very real. I cried for my sister, who I was furious at and also terrified for. And I cried for this version of my life that I believed in completely. The version where Cassidy and I were a team, where she was the one person I'd always trusted without qualification. Because whatever happened next, that version was gone. At some point around 2 in the morning, I opened my laptop and started reading about Ponzi schemes. About how they work, how they collapse, and critically what victims' legal options look like. I found forums where people described almost identical scenarios, the polished website, the early returns, the sudden disappearance. There were threads about filing reports with the FTC and the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. There were discussions about civil lawsuits against perpetrators. Though most of the commenters noted that by the time these schemes collapse, the money is usually gone. I also read, in one thread, a comment that I kept coming back to. It said, the hardest part isn't losing the money. It's watching someone you love make choices that hurt other people and deciding whether you're going to pretend you don't see it. I thought about Cassidy's friends. I thought about the money they'd handed over in good faith, probably excited, probably trusting her the same way she'd trusted the man who took it all. They didn't know it was gone. They were still waiting. By 3 in the morning, I knew what I was going to have to do. I gave myself a few days before I made any calls. Not to talk myself out of it. I think I'd already decided. But because I needed to walk into those conversations clearly, without the rawness of that first night. The first call I made was to my bank. I reported the unauthorized transactions, gave in the dates and amounts, and filed a fraud claim. The representative was kind. She explained that because the account access had been by someone with my PIN, even if I hadn't authorized that specific use, the process would be more complicated than a standard card fraud claim. They opened an investigation. I changed my PIN. I removed the secondary contact from my account, which had been Cassidy, set up in case I ever got locked out. That last one took me longer than it should have. I stared at her name on the screen for a while before I clicked remove. The second call I made was to a consumer fraud attorney I found through my state's Bar Association referral service. Free consultation. She listened to me explain the situation, my sister, the scheme, the borrowed money from friends, my own stolen funds, and she asked me a set of very specific questions that I hadn't thought to ask myself. Did I know the name of the man who ran the investment scheme? Did Cassidy have any documentation, emails, the original website, any records of payments? Did I know whether other investors existed beyond Cassidy and her two friends? I didn't have all the answers, but I knew who did. Talking to my sister again, after those few days, was different from that first night at her kitchen table. The rawness had settled into something more like clarity. I told her that I was reporting the theft from my account to the bank and possibly to the police, and I watched her face go through several things at once. I'm not doing this to destroy you, I said, but I need you to understand that what you did is not something I can quietly absorb. She was quiet for a long moment. What do I need to do? I told her. I told her she needed to contact her friends, both of them, directly, honestly, and tell them what had happened. Not a partial version, not a story about delays in processing, the full truth. She needed to tell them she'd invested their money, the scheme had collapsed, and she didn't have the funds to repay them right now, but she was going to find a way. They're going to hate me, she said. Maybe. That's a consequence of what happened. I didn't mean to hurt them. I know, but they're still hurt. She also needed to file a report with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center about the man who defrauded her. The attorney I'd spoken with explained that individual reports often don't go anywhere on their own, but they're critical for building a picture. If this man had scammed others, and the statistical likelihood was that he had, each report added to the case. Cassidy sat there and listened to all of it without pushing back, which surprised me. I'd expected defensiveness. What I got instead was someone who looked like she'd been waiting for someone to hand her a list of steps, because the chaos of trying to manage it alone had become unbearable. Will you help me? She asked. That question sat between us for a moment. With some of it, I said, but not all of it. Some of it you have to do yourself. She told her friends. She called them the next day, and she did it without me in the room, because that conversation was hers to have. I know how it went only from what she told me afterward. One of them cried, one of them went silent and then said she needed time. Both of them were shocked, not just by the money, but by the months of cover-up, by how long she'd kept it going. I understood that reaction. I'd felt it too. What I didn't expect was how I felt once she'd done it. I'd been bracing for some kind of satisfaction, the rightness of truth finally in the open. But what I actually felt was just tired and sad. Not for the money, which I was still fighting to recover. Not even for myself, exactly. For this whole tangle of things, my sister's humiliation, her friend's shock, the faceless man in another state who had set all of this in motion and probably never thought about any of us. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing someone you love has caused real harm to real people while trying to protect themselves. It doesn't cancel out the love, it doesn't cancel out the anger either. It just sits alongside both of them, and you have to figure out how to carry all three at once. The bank investigation took about 6 weeks. They ultimately determined that while I had voluntarily shared my PIN, the subsequent transactions were unauthorized and outside the scope of that permission. I recovered most of the money. Not all of it, but most. The process involved filing a written dispute, providing screenshots of the transactions and their locations, and a short recorded statement about when and why I had shared the PIN and what I had and hadn't authorized. It was tedious, but it was manageable. I also filed a police report about my sister. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it's the part of the story that I've thought about more than anything else. I filed the report not because I wanted her arrested or prosecuted. I don't, and I told the detective exactly that when we spoke. I filed it because what she did was a crime, and because pretending it wasn't felt like a lie I couldn't live with. The detective was straightforward with me. Given the relationship, the voluntary PIN sharing, and my sister's cooperation, it was unlikely this would result in charges. He took my statement and my documentation. I told Cassidy I'd done it. That conversation was the hardest one. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I understand." I don't know if she did, entirely. But I appreciated that she said it. We don't have dinner together every week anymore. I'm not sure we'll get back to that. At least not for a while. What we do have is a repayment plan. She's paying me back in fixed monthly amounts, small enough to be realistic, and she's doing the same for her friends. It will take her a couple of years. I don't know if her friendships will survive it. I know one of them has pulled back significantly. My sister also started seeing a therapist, which I mention not as some redemptive finale, but because I think it matters. Because the willingness to lie to people you love, to keep escalating the lies to cover the first lie, to borrow from family without asking, that's not just a bad decision. That's someone who needed help and didn't know how to ask for it in any way that felt survivable. I'm not excusing what she did, but I've spent enough time sitting with all of this that I can hold both things. What she did was wrong and caused real harm, and she is still my sister, and those facts don't cancel each other out. I think about what I would have done if I'd let the first instinct win. The one that wanted to absorb it quietly, not cause problems, not be the person who files a police report against their own family. I'd grown up being told that family handles things inside, that loyalty means covering, that making things difficult for the people you love is a kind of disloyalty. I don't believe that anymore. Maybe I never fully believed it, but I believe it even less now. Real loyalty, I think, is something more like honesty. It means not pretending the harm isn't harm. It means trusting that a relationship can survive the truth. And if it can't, then what you were protecting was the appearance of a relationship, not the thing itself. My sister and I are still figuring out what we are now, on the other side of all of this. It's slower than I expected. Some days it feels impossible, and some days it feels like something that might actually be okay eventually. What I know is that I couldn't have gotten here by pretending. I choose transparency now, not because it's easy, but because I've seen what the alternative costs, not just in dollars. Though that's real too. In the parts of yourself you quietly surrender every time you decide the truth is too complicated to say out loud. I'm not willing to surrender those parts anymore. And if you're somewhere in the middle of something like this, if you're staring at a number on a screen that doesn't make sense or holding a conversation that just broke something you thought was permanent, I hope you'll be honest too, even when it's the hardest possible version of what you could choose, especially then. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any cosmic sense, just the plain, quiet logic of how one choice leads to the next, and how the consequences of those choices tend to show up eventually whether you're ready for them or not. Cassidy didn't wake up one morning and decide to steal from me. That's the part that took me the longest to understand. What she did started with a decision that probably felt reasonable at the time, putting her savings into something that looked legitimate, something that was paying out real returns, something a trusted friend had vouched for. One decision. And then when that decision went wrong, she made another one, don't tell anyone. And then another, cover it for a little longer, and then another. The stealing from my account wasn't the beginning of the story, it was the place where a long chain of smaller choices finally became impossible to hide. I don't say that to excuse her. I say it because I think it's important to actually understand how people end up doing things that seem unthinkable. It's rarely one dramatic moment. It's usually a series of moments where someone chose the easier path and then another and another and another until the easier path led somewhere they never intended to go. What I keep coming back to is the part about her friends, Judith and the other woman whose money she'd invested. They were still waiting on their money when I found out. They had no idea it was gone. And I think that's where the real weight of what Cassidy did lies, for me. Not the money she took from me, which was recoverable and which she's paying back, but the months of looking two women she cared about in the face and maintaining a fiction. That requires a particular kind of compartmentalization that I don't think she's proud of, and I don't think she fully understood what it was costing her until it all came apart. There's something I'd come to believe about integrity, and it's this. It's not a quality you either have or don't have. It's something you practice or don't practice, decision by decision. Every time Cassidy chose to say just a little longer instead of telling the truth, she was practicing something. And every time I chose, in those hard weeks after I found out, to be honest about what had happened rather than smooth it over, with the bank, with the detective, with Cassidy herself, I was practicing something too. Resilience isn't about not getting hurt. I got hurt. I cried on my bathroom floor at 2 in the morning over money I'd worked for and a relationship I thought I understood. Resilience is what happens when you get up anyway, when you make the calls you don't want to make, when you do the hard thing because you know that the alternative is becoming someone who lets hard things slide until they become unbearable. I'm not the same person I was before that Tuesday evening. I trust differently now, not less but more carefully. I ask more questions. I pay closer attention, and I've stopped treating loyalty as something that requires silence. The people I love deserve my honesty more than they deserve my protection from it. Cassidy and I are still figuring out who we are to each other now. Some days that feels like progress, some days it just feels like loss. But I'd rather be in the middle of that honest, complicated thing than on the other side of a clean lie that kept us comfortable and kept her drowning. The truth has a way of surfacing. I'd rather be the one who brings it up than the one it buries.